The day my mother-in-law presented my daughter with what she called a priceless family heirloom. The necklace was supposed to have been in their family for generations, passed down through the firstborn daughters. But when I took it to be appraised for insurance, the jeweler told me something that exposed a web of lies going back 30 years. Some family treasures aren't what they seem. Before I tell you about that necklace and what it revealed, I need to tell you about my relationship with my mother-in-law, Catherine, because understanding who she was is crucial to understanding why she did what she did. Catherine was old money. Not just wealthy, but the kind of wealthy where your family name is on buildings, and your ancestors came over on ships that arrived shortly after the Mayflower. Her family had been prominent in our city for 5 generations. They sat on boards of museums and hospitals. They summered in Martha's Vineyard and wintered in Palm Beach. They moved in circles where everyone knew everyone, and everyone had known everyone's parents and grandparents. When I met her son Robert at a community health fair where I was volunteering as a nurse, I had no idea about his background. He was dressed casually, friendly, and down to earth, and he never mentioned his family's wealth or status. We dated for 6 months before I even met his parents, and by that time, I was already in love with him. The first time Robert took me to his family's home, I nearly turned the car around. It wasn't a house, it was an estate. The kind of place you see in magazines, with a circular driveway, columns, and more square footage than anyone could possibly need. Catherine answered the door herself, which I later learned was unusual. The family employed a full-time housekeeper, but Catherine had given her the evening off because she wanted to meet me privately before deciding whether I was worthy of a formal introduction to the wider family. I'll never forget how she looked me up and down, taking in my department store dress, my practical shoes, my lack of expensive jewelry. Her smile was polite but cool, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. She invited me in for tea, and for the next hour, she asked me questions that felt more like an interrogation than a conversation. Where was my family from? What did my parents do? Where had I gone to school? What were my career ambitions? What did I know about Robert's family history? I answered honestly, though I could see with each answer that I was falling short of whatever standard she held. My family was working class. My father had been a mechanic, my mother a secretary. I'd gone to a state school for nursing. I had no family connections or pedigree to speak of. Robert, bless him, sat next to me and held my hand through the whole thing. When Catherine made a particularly pointed comment about the importance of family lineage, Robert told her firmly that he loved me and that my background didn't matter to him. Catherine smiled that cold smile and said, of course it didn't matter, that she was sure I was a lovely girl, but I could see in her eyes that it mattered very much to her. Robert and I got married anyway, despite Catherine's obvious disapproval. She attended the wedding but made her displeasure clear in small ways. She wore black instead of a festive color. She gave a toast that was technically polite but laced with subtle implications that Robert was settling beneath his station. She spent most of the reception talking to people from her social circle while largely ignoring my family and friends. I told myself it didn't matter. I had Robert, and that was enough. Catherine would come around eventually once she saw how happy we were together. But honey, that woman never came around, not in 30 years of marriage. She was always polite to me in public. She never overtly insulted me or caused scenes. But there were 1,000 small ways she let me know I wasn't good enough for her family. She'd introduce me to her friends as Robert's wife, then immediately change the subject before they could ask me anything about myself. She'd give me gifts for Christmas and birthdays that were always slightly wrong clothes in styles that didn't suit me, or in sizes that were a pointed comment on my weight, books on topics I had no interest in, accessories that were too cheap to be generous but positioned as if they were treasures she'd chosen carefully. When Robert and I bought our first house, Catherine toured it with barely concealed disdain, making comments about how cozy it was, how perfect for a starter home, though we were both in our 30s and had no intention of it being temporary. When I got pregnant with our first child, Catherine made it clear she hoped for a boy to carry on the family name. When we had a girl, she seemed disappointed. She sent a gift, a silver rattle that had supposedly been in the family for generations, but she didn't visit the hospital, saying she wasn't feeling well. We named our daughter Elizabeth, after my mother. Catherine suggested we should have chosen a name with more significance to Robert's family, perhaps Catherine or Margaret or Eleanor. I smiled and said Elizabeth was the perfect name for our perfect daughter. Over the years, Catherine's relationship with Elizabeth was complicated. She'd dote on her in front of other people, showing her off as her granddaughter, emphasizing the family connection. But in private, she was critical and cold. She'd comment on Elizabeth's appearance, her manners, her interests, always finding something that wasn't quite up to the family standard. Elizabeth grew up knowing her grandmother didn't quite approve of her, though she couldn't articulate why. She'd ask me sometimes why Grandma Catherine didn't seem to like her as much as she liked other children in the family. Robert had cousins whose children Catherine fawned over, sending them extravagant gifts and including them in family traditions that Elizabeth was somehow always too young or too busy or too something to participate in. I'd tell Elizabeth that her grandmother loved her in her own way, that some people just weren't demonstrative with affection, but I knew the truth. Catherine saw Elizabeth the same way she saw me, as an outsider, someone who didn't have the proper pedigree to be part of the family legacy. Then, 2 years ago, something shifted. Catherine had turned 75, and perhaps facing her own mortality made her reflective. Or perhaps she'd realized that Robert was her only child, and Elizabeth was her only grandchild, and if she wanted any kind of legacy, she'd need to accept the family she had rather than the one she'd envisioned. She started calling more often. She invited Elizabeth to lunch, just the two of them. She started including Elizabeth in family events and traditions. She even made an effort to be warmer to me, though it always felt a bit forced, like she was playing a role rather than experiencing genuine emotion. Robert was thrilled. He'd always been hurt by his mother's coldness toward me and Elizabeth, and seeing her make an effort seemed to heal something in him. He said maybe his mother was finally growing up, finally realizing what really mattered in life. I wanted to believe it, but 30 years of subtle rejection had made me wary. I waited for the other shoe to drop, for Catherine to reveal whatever her real motivation was. Then came Elizabeth's 20th birthday. We had a family dinner at Catherine's estate, a formal affair with Catherine's finest china, and a menu prepared by her personal chef. Catherine presented Elizabeth with a gift wrapped in elegant paper with a silk ribbon. Inside was a velvet jewelry box, clearly antique and expensive. When Elizabeth opened it, she gasped. Inside was a necklace unlike anything I'd ever seen. The necklace was stunning, a delicate gold chain with an intricate pendant featuring what appeared to be diamonds and sapphires arranged in an elaborate design. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the work of a master jeweler. Even to my untrained eye, it looked valuable. Catherine told Elizabeth that this necklace was a family heirloom that had been passed down through the firstborn daughters of their family for 5 generations. She said it had originally belonged to Robert's great-great-great-grandmother, who had received it from her husband on their wedding day in 1875. She said the necklace had been worn by every firstborn daughter in the family at her wedding and on other significant occasions. She told stories about the women who'd worn it, her own grandmother, her mother, even herself on her wedding day. Then Catherine said that she'd been waiting for the right time to pass the necklace to Elizabeth, and now that Elizabeth was entering womanhood and making her own way in the world, it was time for the tradition to continue. She put the necklace around Elizabeth's neck herself, and honey, I'd never seen my daughter so moved. Elizabeth had tears in her eyes as she hugged her grandmother and thanked her for trusting her with such an important piece of family history. Robert was emotional too. He said he remembered his mother wearing that necklace on special occasions when he was growing up. He said it meant everything to him that his mother was passing it to Elizabeth, that it was a sign she'd finally accepted Elizabeth as a true member of the family. I looked at Catherine, and for just a moment I saw something in her expression I couldn't quite read. Then she smiled and suggested we toast to Elizabeth and to family traditions. After dinner, Elizabeth asked if she could wear the necklace home. Catherine hesitated, then said that would be fine, but that Elizabeth should be very careful with it and perhaps get it appraised for insurance purposes. She said the necklace was worth a considerable sum and should be protected. On the drive home, Elizabeth couldn't stop talking about the necklace. She said it made her feel connected to her family history in a way she never had before. She said knowing that her grandmother finally saw her as worthy of the family legacy meant everything to her. I was happy for Elizabeth, truly, but something felt off about the whole thing. I couldn't put my finger on what exactly, but my instincts, the same instincts that had served me well through 30 years of dealing with Catherine, were sending up warning signals. The next day, I told Elizabeth I'd take the necklace to be appraised for insurance like her grandmother had suggested. Elizabeth was reluctant to let it out of her sight, but I assured her I'd take it to the best jeweler in the city and get it back to her by the end of the day. I chose a jeweler I'd known for years, a man named Harold who'd been in the business for 40 years and had a reputation for absolute honesty and expertise. His shop was the kind of place that did appraisals for estates and museums, not just retail customers. Harold welcomed me warmly and asked what he could do for me. I showed him the necklace and explained that it was a family heirloom that had supposedly been in my husband's family for 5 generations. I said I needed it appraised for insurance and asked what he thought it was worth. Harold took out his loupe and examined the necklace carefully. He looked at the chain, the pendant, the stones, the craftsmanship. He was quiet for a long time, and I could see his expression changing from professional interest to something else. Confusion, maybe, or concern. Finally, he put down the loupe and looked at me. He asked me where I'd said this necklace came from. I repeated that it was a family heirloom, that my mother-in-law had given it to my daughter, that it was supposed to have been made in 1875. Harold was quiet for another moment. Then he told me he had some information I needed to hear, and I might want to sit down. He explained that the necklace was indeed valuable. The stones were real diamonds and sapphires, the gold was genuine, and the craftsmanship was excellent. Based on the materials alone, it was worth approximately $15,000. But the necklace had not been made in 1875. The design techniques and materials used dated it to approximately 1995, maybe 30 years old at most. Furthermore, Harold recognized the necklace. He'd seen it before because his shop had sold it. He went into his back office and came out with old records. His shop kept meticulous documentation of every significant piece they sold. There, in the records from 1996, was a photograph of the necklace. It had been custom-made by their shop for a client named Catherine Morrison, Robert's mother. She'd commissioned it herself, chosen the design, selected the stones, and paid $20,000 for it. The receipt was right there in the file. Harold remembered the commission because Catherine had been very specific about what she wanted. She'd brought in a photograph of an antique necklace and asked him to create something similar but with better quality stones. She'd said it was a gift for her niece's wedding. Except Catherine didn't have a niece getting married that year. And now, 28 years later, that same necklace was being presented to my daughter as a family heirloom from 1875. I sat in Harold's shop looking at those records and I felt sick to my stomach. Catherine had lied. The whole story about the necklace being passed down through generations was completely fabricated. She'd commissioned the necklace herself, hidden it away for decades, and then presented it as an heirloom to manipulate my daughter's emotions. But why? What possible reason could she have for such an elaborate deception? I thanked Harold for his honesty and asked him to keep this information confidential. I took the necklace and the copy of the receipt he offered me, and I drove home in a daze. I needed to think this through before I did anything. I needed to understand Catherine's motivation before I confronted her or told Elizabeth the truth. That night, after Elizabeth had gone to bed, I showed Robert the receipt and told him what Harold had revealed. Robert's first reaction was denial. He insisted there must be some mistake, that maybe his mother had commissioned a replica of the original necklace because the original was too valuable to wear or had been lost. I asked him if he really remembered seeing his mother wear that specific necklace when he was growing up, or if he just remembered her wearing nice jewelry in general. After thinking about it, he admitted he wasn't certain. His mother had owned a lot of jewelry, and one necklace looked much like another to him. I asked him about the stories Catherine had told about the necklace being passed down through generations, about specific ancestors wearing it. Robert said he'd never heard those stories before. His mother had never mentioned a special family necklace until she'd given it to Elizabeth. We spent hours talking about it, trying to make sense of what Catherine had done and why. The most generous interpretation was that Catherine had wanted to give Elizabeth something special and meaningful, and lacking a real family heirloom to pass down, had created one. But that didn't feel right. Catherine had real jewelry pieces that actually had been in the family for generations. She'd shown them to me once, kept in a vault at the bank. There were brooches and rings and bracelets that really did date back a century or more. If Catherine wanted to give Elizabeth a genuine heirloom, she had options. Instead, she'd chosen to create an elaborate lie. Robert suggested we just keep the information to ourselves. He said Elizabeth was happy. Catherine had made a gesture toward accepting Elizabeth into the family, and exposing the lie would only hurt everyone. He said sometimes it was better to let people have their illusions if those illusions made them happy. But I couldn't let it go, honey, because this wasn't about a necklace. This was about manipulation and control. This was about Catherine using a fabricated story to create an emotional response in Elizabeth, and I needed to understand why. I decided to do some investigating. I called Robert's Aunt Margaret, Catherine's sister-in-law, and asked her about family jewelry and heirlooms. Margaret was more down-to-earth than Catherine, and had always been kind to me. I asked Margaret if she remembered a special necklace that had been passed down through the firstborn daughters of the family. Margaret said she'd never heard of any such tradition. She said Catherine had beautiful jewelry, but nothing that Margaret knew of had that kind of family significance. I asked Margaret if Catherine's mother or grandmother had any special jewelry that had been passed down. Margaret said Catherine's mother had died fairly young, when Catherine was in her 20s, and hadn't left much of an estate. Catherine's grandmother had died even earlier. Most of Catherine's jewelry had been purchased during her own marriage, not inherited. So the entire story was false. There was no tradition of passing down a necklace through firstborn daughters. There were no generations of women who'd worn it. The whole narrative Catherine had created was pure fiction. I thanked Margaret for the information and hung up, more confused than ever about Catherine's motivation. Then something occurred to me. I called Harold back and asked him if I could see the full file on the necklace commission. He said I could come by the next day. When I reviewed the file, I found something interesting. Catherine had come in for several consultations before the necklace was made. In the notes, Harold had written details about what Catherine wanted. She'd been very specific that the necklace should look antique. She'd wanted it to appear as if it were from the Victorian era. She'd even requested that Harold use techniques that would give it an aged appearance. At the time, Harold had assumed she wanted it to look antique for aesthetic reasons, that she simply preferred that style. But now, looking at those notes, it was clear Catherine had always intended to pass this necklace off as something it wasn't. This wasn't a spontaneous lie. This was a plan she'd put into motion 28 years ago. But that meant Catherine had commissioned this necklace when Elizabeth was only 8 years old. Catherine couldn't have known back then that she'd eventually want to give Elizabeth a family heirloom. Catherine had barely acknowledged Elizabeth's existence at that time. Unless the necklace hadn't originally been intended for Elizabeth. I went back to Harold's records and looked at the date again. May 1996. I thought about what else had been happening in our family around that time. May 1996 was right before Robert's cousin Jennifer's wedding. Jennifer was the daughter of Catherine's brother, and at the time, she was Catherine's favorite among the younger generation. Catherine had doted on Jennifer in ways she never had with Elizabeth. I called Margaret again and asked her what she remembered about Jennifer's wedding. Margaret said it had been a lavish affair, very traditional and formal, exactly the kind of wedding Catherine approved of. She said Catherine had given Jennifer a generous check as a wedding gift and that Jennifer had worn beautiful jewelry on her wedding day. I asked if Jennifer had worn a special necklace. Margaret said she didn't specifically remember, but that Jennifer had been dripping in diamonds and probably had worn several pieces. That's when it clicked for me. Catherine had commissioned the necklace for Jennifer. She'd wanted to establish a tradition of passing down a family heirloom to favored granddaughters, and Jennifer, with her proper upbringing and society connections, was the one Catherine had chosen to start that tradition with. But something must have happened. Maybe Jennifer hadn't liked the necklace. Maybe the wedding plans changed. Maybe Catherine had decided not to give it to her after all. Whatever the reason, the necklace had stayed hidden for 28 years, until Catherine had decided to give it to Elizabeth instead. But why? Why, after decades of making Elizabeth feel like an outsider, would Catherine suddenly present her with this fabricated heirloom? I spent days thinking about this, trying to understand Catherine's psychology. And then I figured it out. Catherine was rewriting history. She'd always resented my presence in Robert's life. She'd never accepted that her only son had married beneath his station. She'd treated Elizabeth as an extension of that disappointment, a grandchild who didn't quite measure up to family standards. But Catherine was getting older. She was 75, and whether she'd admit it or not, she was thinking about her legacy, about how she'd be remembered. And here's the thing, honey. In Catherine's social circle, a grandmother who rejected her only grandchild would be judged harshly. Catherine's friends had watched her cool treatment of Elizabeth over the years. Some of them had probably commented on it, perhaps not directly to Catherine, but certainly among themselves. Catherine cared enormously about what people thought of her. She'd spent her entire life maintaining her reputation and social standing. By presenting Elizabeth with a supposed family heirloom and telling the story of passing it down through generations, Catherine was creating a narrative. She was telling her social circle and her family that she'd always valued Elizabeth, that she'd always seen Elizabeth as a true member of the family, that Elizabeth had always been worthy of inheriting the family's treasures. It was rewriting history to make Catherine look better. It was creating a story that could be told at Catherine's funeral someday, how she'd lovingly pass the family necklace to her granddaughter, maintaining tradition, showing that she valued family above all else. The lie wasn't for Elizabeth's benefit, it was for Catherine's reputation. And honey, once I understood that, I got angry. Because Elizabeth had been so touched by the gesture, she'd felt like her grandmother had finally accepted her, finally saw her as worthy. She'd been moved to tears by what she thought was a genuine gesture of love and acceptance. But it wasn't genuine. It was performance. Catherine was using my daughter's emotions as props in her own reputation management. I told Robert what I'd figured out. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that broke my heart. He said his mother had always been like this, more concerned with appearances than reality, more interested in what people thought than in genuine connection. He said he'd spent his whole life trying to win her genuine approval and had never quite succeeded. Even his achievements, becoming a successful doctor, making a good living, being a good father, were only valuable to Catherine insofar as they reflected well on her. Robert said maybe it was time we stopped letting Catherine control the narrative. We decided to tell Elizabeth the truth. It was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had. Elizabeth was devastated. Not just because the necklace wasn't really an heirloom, but because she realized her grandmother's gesture hadn't been about love or acceptance. It had been about Catherine's image. Elizabeth asked if we could confront Catherine, make her admit what she'd done, but Robert and I decided against it. Confronting Catherine would only give her another opportunity to manipulate the situation, to make herself the victim, to twist things around. Instead, we decided to simply know the truth and act accordingly. Elizabeth kept the necklace. We agreed that regardless of Catherine's motivations, the necklace was still beautiful and valuable, but Elizabeth decided she'd never wear it. She put it in her jewelry box as a reminder of an important lesson that people will sometimes use your emotions to serve their own purposes, and you need to be careful about believing stories that seem too good to be true. A few weeks later, Catherine called and asked Elizabeth to come to a family function wearing the necklace. She wanted to show it off to relatives, to tell the story of passing it down, to bask in the glow of being seen as a loving grandmother. Elizabeth politely declined. She said the necklace was too valuable to wear casually, that she wanted to save it for special occasions. Catherine seemed disappointed but didn't push. Over the following months, Catherine asked several more times about the necklace. She wanted Elizabeth to wear it to various events, always occasions where Catherine's friends and social circle would be present. Each time, Elizabeth found a polite excuse not to wear it. Eventually, Catherine stopped asking. I think she realized that her plan to use the necklace as a prop in her redemption narrative wasn't working out the way she'd hoped. Our relationship with Catherine didn't end, but it changed. We were polite and cordial, but we kept our distance. We accepted that Catherine would never be capable of genuine, unconditional love, and we stopped hoping for something she couldn't give. Robert worked through his own complicated feelings about his mother with a therapist. He came to understand that his mother's limitations weren't a reflection of his worth, that some people are simply not capable of the kind of love and acceptance that others need. Elizabeth, meanwhile, grew stronger from the experience. She'd been hurt by the revelation about the necklace, but she'd also learned an important lesson about reading people's true motivations and not letting others manipulate her emotions. About a year after the necklace incident, Elizabeth got engaged to a wonderful young man named David. When they started planning the wedding, Catherine called and offered to pay for it. She said she wanted Elizabeth to have a proper society wedding, the kind befitting the family name. Elizabeth thanked her but declined. She and David wanted a smaller wedding that reflected their values and personality, not the kind of display Catherine preferred. Catherine was clearly disappointed, but she couldn't say much without revealing that her offer had been about image rather than genuine generosity. At the wedding, Elizabeth wore her grandmother's necklace, not because Catherine wanted her to, but because Elizabeth had decided to reclaim it. She wore it as a reminder that she got to control her own narrative, that she got to decide what things meant to her. When people complimented the necklace and asked about it, Elizabeth told them the truth. She said it was a beautiful piece of jewelry her grandmother had given her, custom-made about 30 years ago. No lies, no fabricated history, just the simple truth. Catherine looked uncomfortable when she overheard Elizabeth's description, but what could she say? She couldn't insist Elizabeth tell the false story without admitting she'd lied in the first place. Now, let me tell you what I learned from all this, because there are important lessons here. First, not everyone who claims to love you has your best interests at heart. Sometimes people use the language of love and family to manipulate you into serving their purposes. Catherine used the necklace and the story of family tradition to try to rehabilitate her image, not to genuinely connect with Elizabeth. Second, trust your instincts. From the moment Catherine gave Elizabeth that necklace, I felt like something was off. I didn't ignore that feeling, and because I investigated, we learned the truth before we could be further manipulated. Third, actions over words. Catherine could tell stories about family tradition and heritage all day long, but her actions over 30 years had showed that she didn't truly accept Elizabeth as part of the family. The necklace didn't change that reality, it just obscured it temporarily. Fourth, you can't control how others behave, but you can control how you respond. We couldn't make Catherine be a better person or a more genuine grandmother. But we could choose not to participate in her manipulation. We could maintain boundaries while still being civil. And finally, honey, real family heirlooms aren't about the objects themselves, they're about the love and connection behind them. I gave Elizabeth a simple gold locket that had belonged to my mother. It wasn't worth much money, but it came with genuine love and real family history. That locket meant more to Elizabeth than Catherine's expensive fabrication ever could. Catherine passed away last year at age 76. At her funeral, several people mentioned the beautiful necklace she'd given to Elizabeth, how it showed what a devoted grandmother she'd been. The narrative she'd tried to create had partially worked, at least among people who didn't know the full story. But Elizabeth and Robert and I knew the truth, and that truth had set us free from continuing to seek approval from someone who was never going to give it genuinely. Elizabeth still has that necklace. She says someday she might give it to her own daughter if she has one. But she'll tell the truth about where it came from and what it represents, not a family tradition of love and acceptance, but a lesson in recognizing when people are using you for their own purposes. That's more valuable than any heirloom, honey. That's the kind of inheritance that actually matters. The necklace Catherine gave my daughter wasn't a family treasure passed down through generations. It was a prop in a performance designed to make Catherine look good. But by discovering the truth, we turned it into something else, a reminder to value authenticity over appearance, substance over show, and genuine love over manipulative gestures. And that, more than any jewelry could ever be, is truly priceless. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel for more true stories about family manipulation, toxic in-laws, and learning to see through false gestures. Have you ever received a gift that was really about controlling how others saw the giver? Have you dealt with a mother-in-law or family member who cared more about appearances than genuine relationships, or discovered that a cherished family story was actually a complete fabrication? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your stories matter, and this community is here to support each other through these complex family dynamics. Remember, always trust your instincts when something feels off, even about gifts that seem generous on the surface, and know that real love doesn't come with strings attached or hidden agendas. Actions over words, always. Don't let anyone use your emotions or your children's emotions as props in their performance for others. Set boundaries, seek the truth when needed, and surround yourself with people who love you authentically, not conditionally. The most valuable inheritances aren't objects, they're lessons about integrity, authenticity, and knowing your worth. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next story.